I've always believed that my grandpa had the biggest heart in the world. He was the kind of man who would give you the coat off his back on a cold winter's day, even if it meant he would be shivering. To him, family wasn't just important, it was everything. Every Sunday, without fail, we'd gather around his long oak dining table, and he'd sit at the head, smiling as he listened to the noise and chatter, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. When my cousin announced her engagement, I don't think anyone was happier than Grandpa. The way his eyes lit up when he heard the news, you'd think it was his own wedding. He spoke about it endlessly, how beautiful she'd look in her gown, how proud her father would have been if he were still alive, how he wanted the day to be perfect in every way. Grandpa had always stepped into the role of father figure for her, and this was his chance to give her the wedding she'd always dreamed of. In the weeks that followed, he became more involved than anyone expected. He offered to help with expenses, and not just in a small way. When he wrote that check for $50,000, I swear I saw a tear in his eye, not because of the amount, but because of the joy he thought it would bring. To him, it wasn't just money. It was love, wrapped in paper. He even started practicing his speech for the reception. "It's not every day you get to see your little girl walk down the aisle," he'd say, chuckling as if he couldn't quite believe how fast the years had gone. The house was filled with his excitement. But looking back now, I wish I could have frozen that time. I wish I could have bottled up his joy before the storm rolled in. Because if we had known what was coming, what would happen on that perfect day, none of us would have believed it. Not in 1,000 years. Grandpa's life had never been easy, and that was something he carried like a quiet badge of honor. He was born in a small town where opportunities were scarce and expectations were modest. His father had been a factory worker, his mother a seamstress, and together they raised their children on a shoestring budget. By the time Grandpa was 16, he was already juggling 2 jobs, stocking shelves at a grocery store in the mornings and hauling crates at the docks in the evenings. He used to joke that he learned to value $1 before he even learned to shave. After years of hard work, he landed a job as a junior clerk at a shipping company. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and steady was gold to a man who'd grown up counting pennies. Bit by bit, he climbed the ranks, making smart choices with his earnings. He bought a modest home, invested in a few small properties, and saved like his life depended on it. It took him decades, but when he finally retired, he had more than enough to live comfortably. Still, he never forgot the lean years, and that memory made him generous in ways most people couldn't understand. Helping family wasn't just something he did, it was part of who he was. When a niece needed tuition money for college, Grandpa paid it without a second thought. When a nephew's wife was diagnosed with cancer, Grandpa quietly covered the medical bills. He never made speeches about it or asked for recognition. His reward was seeing the people he loved live without the crushing weight of debt or worry. The bride, my cousin, had always held a special place in his heart. Her father, Grandpa's only son, died in a car accident when she was just 6 years old. From that day on, Grandpa stepped into every role her father would have played, attending school events, teaching her to ride a bike, showing up at every birthday. He never let her feel alone, and I think in his heart, he felt it was his duty to give her the life her father would have wanted. When she announced her wedding, Grandpa saw it as a milestone not just in her life, but in his own. He remembered her as the little girl in pigtails, holding his hand on the way to school, and now she was about to walk into her future. He wanted that day to be perfect. Not good enough, not budget-friendly, but unforgettable. That's when he decided to give her $50,000, a sum that would cover the venue, catering, and all the little extras that turn a wedding from nice to spectacular. The way he presented the gift was so typical of him, humble, heartfelt, and without any fanfare. He called her over one afternoon when she came by to visit, poured her a cup of tea, and slid a simple white envelope across the table. "For your special day," he said, smiling with that warmth that seemed to make any room brighter. She gasped when she saw the check, covering her mouth with her hand. "Grandpa, this is too much," she'd said, her eyes wide with disbelief. He chuckled and waved her off. "Nonsense. Nothing's too much for my little girl." The room was filled with gratitude and laughter that day. Everyone who heard about it praised him for his generosity. And as far as Grandpa knew in that moment, his gift had brought nothing but joy. But that was before the wedding day, before the moment that would shatter the quiet pride he felt and leave a bruise on his heart that would never quite fade. From the moment the engagement party ended, the wedding machine kicked into full gear. There were meetings with planners, endless phone calls, and group chats that buzzed day and night with color schemes, catering options, and song lists. Grandpa, despite being in his 70s, showed up to every planning session he was invited to, sitting quietly at the edge of the table, listening intently, and occasionally offering a thoughtful suggestion. One afternoon, over tea at his house, he made a generous offer. "If you like, we can host the garden ceremony here at the estate," he told the bride, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "The roses will be in full bloom by then. It'll be beautiful." She smiled politely but glanced quickly at her fiancé before replying, "Oh, we're thinking of a more modern venue. But that's sweet of you to offer." Her voice was warm enough, but something in her tone made me think she had already dismissed the idea long before Grandpa spoke. As the weeks passed, I began to notice little things, small, almost invisible slights, that seemed to escape Grandpa's notice. There was one meeting about the catering menu that he wasn't invited to. Another about the seating arrangements where his name somehow never made it into the group chat. When I asked him about it, he just chuckled. "It's their big day. They probably didn't want to bother me with the details." It was such a Grandpa thing to say, always giving others the benefit of the doubt. The bride's future in-laws, however, were harder to ignore. At every gathering, they kept their conversations contained to their own circle, rarely acknowledging Grandpa unless it was absolutely necessary. Once, I overheard the groom's mother telling someone, "He's very old-fashioned." The way she said it made the word sound like an insult. But Grandpa, ever the optimist, didn't seem to notice or didn't care. He was far too focused on making sure everything went smoothly. One evening, after a particularly long planning meeting, he pulled the groom aside in the hallway. "I just wanted to share something my father told me before my wedding." Grandpa began warmly. "It's not about the size of the day. It's about the size of the promise you're making." The groom gave a polite half-smile and checked his phone. "Yeah, sure. That's great advice," he said, already walking away toward the others. Grandpa stood there for a moment, watching him go, before returning to the table. He didn't mention it again, and I don't think anyone else noticed the brief shadow that crossed his face. Still, he kept showing up, kept contributing, kept believing that this wedding would be a celebration of love and family. Looking back now, those small red flags weren't just random moments. They were warning signs. But at the time, none of us could have imagined just how much they foreshadowed what was coming on the big day. The morning of the wedding dawned with the kind of golden sunlight that photographers dream about. The venue, a sprawling country estate rented for the day, looked like something out of a magazine. White chairs lined up in perfect rows on the manicured lawn, an arch draped with blush-pink roses and cascading ivy standing proudly at the end of the aisle. Strings of fairy lights were woven into the trees, ready to glow as dusk fell. Everywhere you looked, there were little details that spoke of careful planning and, of course, generous funding. Grandpa arrived early, dressed in his best charcoal suit and a tie in the wedding's color scheme, a soft, dusty rose. He moved slowly but with purpose, shaking hands with the staff, complimenting the florist on the arrangements, even pausing to straighten a row of chairs. It was his money that had made all this possible, and though he'd never say it out loud, there was a quiet pride in his eyes. As the guests began to arrive, the air filled with laughter, chatter, and the scent of fresh flowers. Grandpa greeted everyone warmly, clasping hands, patting shoulders, and exchanging small memories with distant relatives he hadn't seen in years. People lit up when they saw him, and he seemed to soak in the joy of the moment. Then the ceremony began. Music floated through the air as the wedding party made their way down the aisle. The bride appeared at last, radiant in a flowing gown, her veil catching the sunlight. Grandpa's eyes misted over. I glanced at him and saw the corners of his mouth lift into a smile, the kind that comes from deep in the heart. The vows were tender, filled with promises of loyalty, love, and partnership. The bride's voice trembled slightly as she spoke, and the groom squeezed her hand in reassurance. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and the crowd erupted into applause. For Grandpa, in that moment, every dollar and every hour he'd invested felt worth it. As the guests made their way to the reception hall, the atmosphere remained warm and lively. The hall was even more stunning than the outdoor ceremony space. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, tables draped in silk, centerpieces overflowing with roses and peonies. Grandpa found his seat near the front, close enough to see the dance floor and the head table clearly. He chatted with those around him, a smile never leaving his face. To him, this was it, the culmination of months of preparation, a day that would be remembered for decades. The clinking of glasses, the hum of conversation, and the soft strains of music created a bubble of happiness he thought nothing could burst. Then the MC announced it was time for the speeches. The reception was just beginning. None of us knew that within the next few minutes, the atmosphere would shift so sharply it would feel like the air had been sucked out of the room. Grandpa still sat there, relaxed and content, completely unaware of the moment that was about to break his heart. The clinking of glasses quieted the room as the bride rose from her seat, a microphone in hand and a beaming smile on her face. Her new husband stood beside her, his arm draped casually around her waist. She looked beautiful. There was no denying that. Her dress shimmering under the soft light of the chandeliers, her cheeks flushed with happiness. "Feist," she began, her voice light but clear. "I want to thank everyone for being here to celebrate this special day with us. Your presence means the world." The crowd murmured their approval, raising their glasses slightly. Grandpa's eyes softened as he watched her. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. The moment when she might look his way, smile, and acknowledge not just the money but the years of love and support he'd poured into her life. "I especially want to thank my new family," she continued, turning toward her in-laws. "Mom, Dad, I don't know how I would have pulled this off without your incredible generosity. You've supported us in every way imaginable, and I'll never forget all you've done for us." A wave of polite applause rippled through the room. Grandpa's smile faltered, but only for a second. He waited for the next sentence, certain his turn was coming. "And to everyone who helped make this day perfect, from the amazing caterers to the decorators, thank you, thank you, thank you." She lifted her glass high, her eyes scanning the crowd, but they never landed on him. Grandpa's name was never mentioned. Not once. I felt my stomach tighten as the realization sank in. From where I sat, I could see his face clearly. The brightness in his eyes dimmed ever so slightly, and the corners of his mouth pulled into a faint, uncertain smile. He didn't frown, didn't show anger, just sat there, still and quiet, holding his champagne flute loosely in one hand. Across the room, the cameraman panned over the tables, capturing candid shots for the wedding video. For a brief second, the lens rested on Grandpa. It caught him in that in-between moment, trying to maintain his dignity while processing the sting of being so publicly overlooked. At our table, an awkward silence settled in. A couple of relatives exchanged glances. One aunt leaned toward me and whispered, "Did she just not mention him?" I nodded slightly, unable to take my eyes off Grandpa. He gave a small, polite clap as the bride finished her speech and sat down, her face glowing as she leaned in to kiss her new husband. The music swelled, the conversation picked up again, and to anyone else in the room, it was just another wedding toast. But I knew that something in Grandpa's heart had shifted in that moment. And though he never would have admitted it, I think a part of him understood right then that the day he'd worked so hard to make special wasn't quite the celebration he had imagined. I sat frozen in my chair for a few seconds after the applause faded, my hands gripping the edge of the tablecloth. I kept replaying her words in my head, waiting for the part where she'd at least acknowledge him. It never came. My chest burned with a mix of shock and anger. How could she possibly overlook him like that? How could she thank people who had done a fraction of what he had, and leave out the man who had practically raised her and funded the entire day? I glanced at Grandpa. He still wore that faint, polite smile, as if nothing unusual had happened. If you didn't know him well, you'd think he hadn't even noticed. But I knew. I could see it in the way his eyes didn't quite meet anyone else's, in the way he set his champagne flute down without taking a sip. A few relatives leaned toward him during dinner. "I'm sure she just forgot to mention you," one said awkwardly. Another shook her head, muttering, "That was strange." Grandpa simply chuckled, waving a hand as if brushing away a fly. "Oh, I'm sure it was just a mistake," he said lightly. "It's her day. That's what matters." His tone was warm, but his voice was softer than usual, almost like it had lost some of its weight. Meanwhile, the bride floated from table to table, laughing with her new in-laws, clinking glasses with friends, posing for photos. She passed Grandpa's table twice without stopping. Once, their eyes met for a brief second, and she gave him a quick smile before turning away to join another group in conversation. Dinner was served, music played, and the dance floor filled. But at our table, the atmosphere felt heavy. I tried to keep up small talk with the cousins beside me, but my attention kept drifting back to Grandpa. He was quieter than usual, answering questions with short replies, and more often than not, simply watching the room in silence. Halfway through the dancing, he leaned toward me. "I think I'll head home," he said gently. "It's been a long day." I glanced at the clock. It wasn't even 9 yet. "Are you sure?" I asked. He smiled faintly. Yes. Let the young ones enjoy themselves." And just like that, he stood, gave a polite nod to the table, and walked out. No announcement, no goodbye to the bride or groom, no fuss. He simply slipped away, leaving behind the laughter, the music, and the people who would never know what they had just taken from him. In the weeks after the wedding, something in Grandpa changed. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't slam doors or make bitter comments. But the shift was there, subtle and steady, like the slow fading of sunlight at the end of the day. He still came to Sunday dinners, still poured himself tea and asked how everyone was doing, but the sparkle in his eyes was dimmer. He listened more than he spoke, smiling faintly at conversations without really joining in. I tried to bring it up one afternoon while we were in his garden, pruning roses. "Grandpa," I began carefully, "you've seemed different since the wedding." He clipped a stem and tossed it into the pile before answering. "Different? No, just tired. Getting old, I suppose." I wanted to press him, but the way he changed the subject, asking about my work, then about the tomatoes, told me he wasn't ready to talk. 2 weeks later, the bride finally called him. I was at his house when the phone rang, and I could hear her cheerful voice through the receiver. "Grandpa, how are you?" she said brightly. They exchanged a few pleasantries before she got to the point. She and her new husband were planning their honeymoon, but they'd gone over budget on the wedding. "I was wondering," she said, her tone light, "if you could maybe help us out a little, just to cover the flights and hotel. We'd pay you back, of course." It was the first time I had ever heard Grandpa say no to her. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I've already given my gift." There was a pause on the other end, long enough for me to imagine her surprise. "Oh, okay. Well, thanks anyway," she said quickly before ending the call. After that, the phone didn't ring as often, but the family chatter didn't stop. Word got around, as it always does. Some relatives whispered that she had been ungrateful at the wedding, that she should have at least mentioned his name in her speech. Others shrugged it off, saying it was just an oversight, that people get nervous during toasts and forget things. One evening at dinner, my aunt said flatly, "She's young. She didn't mean to hurt anyone." Another cousin shook her head. "No, she knew exactly what she was doing. You don't forget the man who paid for your wedding." Grandpa listened quietly, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. He simply refilled his teacup and asked if anyone wanted more bread. It became clear to me that he had no intention of confronting her. That wasn't his way. But I also knew something else, something unspoken. The part of him that had once gone out of his way to give her everything she needed was gone. Not out of anger, but because he understood now, in a way he hadn't before, exactly where he stood in her priorities. And I think that hurt more than he would ever let on. One crisp Thursday morning, a few weeks after that phone call, Grandpa put on his best coat and hat and asked me to drive him into town. He didn't say why. only that he had an appointment. We pulled up in front of a modest brick building with a brass plaque by the door. The office of Mr. Dawson, the family lawyer he'd trusted for decades. I waited in the car while Grandpa went inside. Nearly an hour passed before he returned, moving a little slower but wearing a look I couldn't quite read. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a kind of quiet resolve. Later that evening, over tea, he finally told me what he'd done. "I made a few changes to my will," he said, stirring his cup. "It was overdue anyway." He didn't elaborate, so I asked what kind of changes. He looked at me steadily and said, "She's been removed." I didn't need to ask who he meant. The share he had once set aside for her, money he had always imagined would help her buy a home or start a family, would now go to a children's charity and be divided among the other grandchildren. "They'll appreciate it," he said simply, as if it were just another household chore he'd ticked off his list. What struck me most was that there was no spite in his voice. He wasn't seeking revenge or trying to teach her a lesson. He just adjusted his plans to match reality. She had shown him where he stood in her life, and he'd responded accordingly. He never called her to explain. He didn't want an argument or an apology. In his mind, the matter was settled. The gift he had given her for her wedding was the last she would receive from him. From that point on, he moved forward, his dignity intact, carrying the unspoken understanding that some ties, once loosened, are never pulled tight again. It was almost a year to the day after the wedding when the family gathered at my aunt's house for a summer barbecue. The air was warm, the smell of grilled corn and burgers drifting across the yard, kids running around with juice boxes in hand. Grandpa was in his usual spot under the shade of the old maple tree, sipping iced tea and watching the chaos with a small smile. The bride, now settled into married life, arrived late with her husband. She made her way around the yard, chatting easily with relatives, before finally pulling up a chair beside Grandpa. "Grandpa," she began, her tone casual but sweet, "we've found the perfect house. It's a little more than we budgeted for, though. I was wondering if you might be able to help us with a down payment. Just a little boost to get us started." For a moment, he didn't answer. He simply set his glass down, folded his hands in his lap, and looked at her with that steady, unreadable expression I'd come to know so well. Then he spoke, his voice calm and even. "Sweetheart," he said, "I already gave you your gift. You just didn't notice it." The words hung in the air like the toll of a bell. Conversations around us slowed, then stopped altogether. I watched as a flicker of confusion crossed her face, quickly replaced by the dawning realization of what he meant. Her smile faltered, the color draining slightly from her cheeks. No one said a word, but the silence spoke volumes. The relatives who had been whispering about the wedding for months understood instantly. Even her husband glanced away, suddenly very interested in the grill on the far side of the yard. Grandpa didn't elaborate, didn't explain or remind her about the $50,000, the planning meetings, or the toast where her thanks had gone elsewhere. He just picked up his glass again, took a slow sip, and turned his gaze back toward the children playing on the lawn. The moment passed, but the weight of it lingered. She had gotten her answer, and everyone they knew it was final. In the weeks after that barbecue, I found myself thinking about Grandpa more than usual. Not just about what he had said to her, but about how he had said it, calm, measured, without a trace of anger. Most people in his position might have shouted, demanded an apology, or recounted every slight in detail. But Grandpa wasn't most people. He didn't need to win an argument to know he was right. I realized then that the lesson he had taught us all wasn't about money at all. It was about gratitude, how the simplest acknowledgement can mean more than the grandest gift, and how the absence of it can leave a wound no amount of wealth can heal. His generosity had always come from the heart, but now I understood that it was never truly about what he gave. It was about the connection that gift represented. By choosing not to confront her directly, Grandpa had protected something far more valuable than the $50,000, his dignity. He didn't tarnish it with bitterness or pettiness. Instead, he let his silence speak, and in doing so, he gave her a lesson that no lecture could have delivered so sharply. One sunny afternoon, I visited him at his home. He was in his garden, kneeling by the rose bushes, his hat shielding his face from the sun. I stood there for a moment, watching him work with the same care he had always shown to everything and everyone he loved. When he finally noticed me, he straightened up, wiping his hands on his trousers, a smile spreading across his face. "You're quiet today," I said, handing him a glass of lemonade. He took it, sipped slowly, then looked at me with that knowing glint in his eye. "Sometimes," he said softly, "silence is the loudest answer." The breeze stirred the roses behind him, and I realized that for all the noise and drama that had surrounded the past year, Grandpa had found his peace, not in what he'd lost, but in what he'd chosen to keep.